Hey everybody, today we are debating whether or not belief in the tooth fairy is less justified than belief in God, and we're starting right now. Ladies and gentlemen, thrilled to have you here. If you can let me know if anything's wrong with the audio, we've had some problems in the last couple of weeks. I think we're back on track. So stoked to be here. Oh yeah, we are going to debate an unusual topic tonight in the sense that it's a little bit more provocatively placed. But I can tell you from getting to know the speakers already, they're actually very pleasant people. I think you're really going to enjoy it. So with that, want to mention their links are both in the description below. So if you really enjoy the speakers and you're like, I like that, you can check out more of their content down in the description by clicking those links. Also, want to say, if this is your first time here, consider hitting that subscribe button as we're trying to build an eclectic community, and hopefully reminders of future debates will be helpful to you. And also, by the way, because sometimes I'm surprised people tell us, I've had it a few times now, they say, I don't get the notifications. I've clicked the bell. I don't even get them still. So we are on Twitter and Facebook. If it's useful as a reminder whenever we have streams coming up, you can follow us on there. And feel free to say hi, because I actually love hearing from people. And if I'm behind on emails or anything like that, I'm sorry. I'm working on it. It's been a crazy day. I'm not even wearing my blazer. Did you notice that? No blazer. I usually have my Goodwill blazer and I'm pumped, but without the blazer, it's just been a busy day. So, going to let these gentlemen introduce themselves. Really excited to have them here. And trying to think of any last house cleaning. We do have a ton of debates coming up. I'm not joking. We have like pretty much almost one every single day starting on Sunday for like a week. It's just a ton of them got lined up, and I had a little more free time starting after this weekend. One of them is going to be our first in-person debate. I am thrilled about this. We have never done it before, but we are going to have our first in-person debate with Tom Jump and Stephen Worthy, and it's going to be in my home state of Wisconsin. So you know it's going to be good. So that's going to be a big one. We're really excited about that. We're collaborating with a church is letting us host the debate there. So it will be live streamed, and it will also have a live audience for those who live in the Appleton, Neenah, Oshkosh area in Wisconsin. So, tell you more about it as we go. Want to let the speakers share about themselves. As we just want to say thanks for being here, Dry Apologist and Randolph. We're really just glad to have you hang out with us. And Dry Apologist, we'll let you go first if you want to just share a little bit about yourself. Again, thanks for being here.
All right, yeah, thanks so much for having me, and thanks Randolph for doing this as well. So not a lot to say about myself. I'm a practicing Catholic. I have a YouTube channel with a few videos called Dry Apologist. They're apologetic, philosophical videos. You can check that out, and that's really pretty much it.
Okay, thank you. My name is Randolph Richardson. I am the founding president of the Canadian Atheists. And our website is at www.canadianatheists.ca. I'm very happy to be in this conversation / debate with Caleb. We had a chat the other day in the YouTube comments, and now here we are. This is materializing. I guess Caleb, is before you start with your opening statement, perhaps you would like to describe what you think how you feel it means to be a Catholic. Like I assume it involves belief in the deity. How important is the Bible? That sort of thing. And then I'll just talk briefly about what atheism is.
All right, yeah, definitely.
Forgive me for cutting in.
Sure.
I'm so sorry. Someone just let me in the live chat. They said, "Hey, you don't have the right title." So sorry. This is like a last minute debate, and so we just found out that we were able to have it tonight. So I just updated. Please let me know if the title now is correct. It should be, is belief in the tooth fairy less justified than belief in God? Not the one on evolution, the theory of evolution being dangerous. That's this Friday. So sorry about that. Gosh. Okay. Well, thanks again. Dry Apologist, the floor is yours.
It's looking correct to me, by the way.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So, yeah, I mean, to be a Catholic, of course, I believe in God. I believe he's a Trinity. I subscribe to the Catholic doctrines. And then about the Bible, you asked. So I do believe the Bible is the vehicle through which God communicates his truths. also through the Catholic Church, but I don't think that we can necessarily always know how God has used the Bible. So I'm not going to be, I don't take like a fundamentalist type approach to it. I'm more flexible in how I approach, especially some of those more difficult passages. And obviously that's a complex issue, but that's more a general position on it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'll just talk briefly about what atheism means to me then. We are, as atheists, we are, I would say, absent of belief in deities. I don't like to use the word lack because I feel that it incurs some baggage implying that something's missing. So, and it is a polysemous word, so it can be used in different ways, but most fundamentally, this is what it means. And this is what we promote with Canadian atheists in our attempts to bring an end to the unmitigated vilification of atheists worldwide, and especially here at home. Although we seem to see a lot less of it here in Canada than in some other countries, it still does occur, unfortunately. I'd like to see vilification of any group kind of brought to an end, because I don't think it's very helpful. So thank you. Yeah. I guess you have an opening statement.
Okay, yeah. So with our discussion, yes, this will be interesting. So comparing the belief in God and belief in the tooth fairy and the rational justification for either one. So I don't think that it's rationally justified for an educated adult to believe in the tooth fairy, but I do think it's rationally justified to believe in God. I actually think it's the more plausible position to hold, though I don't think somebody is ignorant or unintelligent or uninformed if they are an atheist, but theism is what I consider to be the more reasonable position. But in the contrast with that and the tooth fairy is there are several points. So first, there are a number of people who claim to have experienced God or experienced miracles. I don't want to focus on that though, because I know that doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't even apply to all Christians. So the 2 points I really want to focus on, and obviously I don't think there are many people that are claiming to have experienced the tooth fairy or miracles from the tooth fairy, but that's not the main point I want to focus on. The 2 points I want to focus on, which are the ones that I had commented on before, are that the tooth fairy to me is something we should expect to find empirical, somewhat scientific or quasi-scientific evidence for within the universe, because I view it as a finite being within the universe, something that we should expect to see some sort of interactions with, some sort of empirical data for. I don't know that that's necessarily true for God. Of course, I do believe God has performed miracles and does, but even if there were no evidence for miracles, God being a being outside the universe that causally sustains the universe, I don't think it would be required to have any empirical evidence for God, and it could still be reasonable to believe in God. But a lack of empirical evidence for the tooth fairy does, I think, strongly count against the existence of the tooth fairy. So that's my first point. And then my second point is that I think that there are plausible logical arguments in favor of God's existence. The one that I'm a big proponent of is the argument from Contingency, which I can break down a little. I don't know of any plausible logical arguments for the tooth fairy. So that's the other point. So those are my 2 main points. Just to kind of recap, I don't expect there to be empirical evidence for God necessarily. I do expect there to be for the tooth fairy. And I don't know of any plausible arguments for the tooth fairy, but I do think there's at least one, at least plausible, I would say very strong argument for God's existence. So that's to me where God is more rationally justified. Belief in God is more rationally justified than the tooth fairy. So.
Okay. Would you be willing to explain what the argument from Contingency is?
Yeah, definitely. So there are a lot of different versions, and the version that I present isn't necessarily the one that everybody out there will say is the strongest version, and I may disagree with their versions and so on. I mean, there's at least probably 10 different versions.
Then this is the one we should go over, though. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. So the one that I like right now, at least, is that, okay, so contingent things are things that exist, but they didn't have to exist, like the flag behind you and everything behind you and yourself and so on. So things that exist but didn't have to exist. Well, I like to say necessary reality is something that exists and it had to exist and it has to exist at all times and moments. Okay, so those would just be the definitions. Whether you believe there is a necessary reality or not, those are just the definitions. Okay, now or I should ask, do those definitions, does that make sense?
Yeah, I think those will be just fine. Okay.
Okay, great. Okay. So from there, let's just say that no contingent things existed, because they could have failed to exist. Even if they've always existed, let's just say that none of them had existed, okay? I would say whatever is left is necessary by definition, okay? Now you could say, well, maybe nothingness would be left. I don't know if you think that's a possible position, but let's just say, then I would say, well, nothingness is necessary then. So if you take away all the contingent stuff, whatever is left is necessary by definition. Does that seem at least logically coherent?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. I'm curious about nothingness. Would you be willing to solidify a position on nothingness being, like, I assume absolutely nothing is what we're talking about. No rules, no nothing.
Right.
Is something that it seems that it could exist. It could be, it's contradictory,
right.
I know, but it could be that it is part of reality somewhere, somehow.
Right, yeah, by nothing, I mean absolutely nothing. So I don't mean like in the Lawrence Krauss sense of nothing, like it's like a kind of something, but I mean absolutely nothing.
Me too.
Right, so so if that was what there was, that kind of reality, then that would be that necessary state, whatever you want to call it. Okay, and I don't think that that's a possible state, of course, because we have stuff, and I believe God is the necessary being, but I'm just laying it out there as a conceptually, like a category, like a thought.
So you don't actually hold a position on whether or not absolutely nothing is possibly real.
Right.
Okay.
Right, I don't think it is real, because I mean there's something, but I'm just saying, let's just say for the sake of argument, as a conceptual position, I'm just laying it out there as, that would be a possible position somebody could hold. Well, what if there was nothing? Okay, then I would say then that would be necessary.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. So yeah, you're like me. You don't know for certain if it could be part of reality. It's an interesting thing to get into, though, and I hope we do get into it today.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, definitely. Okay. So from there, let's just say if we took away all the contingent stuff, there would be a necessary state or reality of some kind left. Okay.
Say that again. You broke up a bit. I'm sorry.
Oh, sorry. If we took away all the contingent things, if they failed to exist, then whatever is left would be that necessary state of reality, right?
Okay.
Okay. So what I would say is that necessary state of reality is something that could not be limited in its properties, and I can go into the reason why. And an unlimited reality or unlimited state of reality is what we mean by God. That's just something that has no limits on its properties is something that would, by definition, have to be all-powerful, all-knowing, couldn't be limited by space or time, so spaceless, timeless, therefore immaterial because it's not limited by space, and matter is a material configuration. And I would also argue all good, although that's going to need some unpacking. And I mean, a spaceless, timeless, all-powerful, all-knowing, all good, necessary reality, that meets the standard philosophical definition of God. Now, I understand that argument itself perhaps needs some defense and clarification, but that's where I'm going with that argument. That's my version, at least, of the argument from contingency. And then a necessary reality is what gives existence to contingent things. It's that more fundamental stratum of reality, because it's what exists with if all the contingent things didn't exist. So again, that's what we mean by God. He's the necessary reality that gives existence to everything else.
Oh, okay. Do you think so? Do you think it's possible for these contingent things, to exist at some point and then completely disappear? Not like change into something else, but just be completely gone.
Yeah,
disappear.
Yeah, I think that's possible. Yes.
Oh, okay. Can you give me an example of something that would qualify as that?
Sure. And when I say it's possible, I'm not committing to the position that is the case, but I'm saying it's possible. So like, for example, like the flag behind you, at one point, it wasn't there. Somebody stitched it together. But of course, the particles that make it up, they existed. And you could hold that those particles have always existed. And I'm fine with that because I would say that those particles are contingent. They could have failed to exist. Now, I know there's going to be comments right now saying, well, how do you know they're contingent? And this is what I'm going to say. I'm already going to beat them to it. If they're necessary, that's fine. They can argue that particles are necessary for the sake of argument, but then there's that next premise. The necessary reality can't be limited by anything. Well, particles have limits. They can no longer be the necessary reality. To me, that's the key point in this argument, is why would the necessary reality have to be unlimited? But I think once somebody accepts that premise, I think you have to grant that God exists. Okay? Or at least, I know I need to unpack some of the attributes, but something like God would have to exist.
Do you think, like, obviously, from my perspective, reality is necessary for my existence. And this is probably, I think, what most people would reasonably agree on. You agree with that, right?
Right.
Okay. Do you think reality itself is necessary?
Yeah, I mean, reality, some state of reality is necessary. So the contingent aspects.
Kind of a more objective way that has nothing to do with us.
Mm-hmm. So let me clarify on that. What do you mean by reality? Do you mean that some form of existence, or do you
say our whole cosmos is our whole cosmos, which is to us reality? Is this necessary?
I don't think so, because the cosmos itself has limitations. But kind of like when I was saying that the particles, you could, for the sake of argument, argue that they're necessary, and then we move on to the next step. You could, for the sake of argument, say, well, maybe the cosmos is necessary. And by cosmos, I assume you mean like space, time, multiverse, or whatever.
Yeah,
sure.
All of that. That's
yeah.
my understanding. That's a standard of what it means too. So yeah. We're talking the same language here, so that's good.
yeah. And I would say, for the sake of argument, like, that second premise of the argument where you're like, okay, a necessary state, there's some necessary state of reality. At that point, you could say that's the cosmos, and I'm fine with that. It's when we get to that third step of the argument where then I say, well, the necessary state of reality has to be unlimited, where I would say the cosmos is then ruled out.
Oh, okay.
As the necessary reality.
So there is this interesting thing. I guess we're kind of venturing into what happened before the cosmos, before the universe, before everything. Or as Douglas Adams likes to say, life, the universe, and everything. The cosmos, are you a proponent of the idea that your God created the cosmos and basically created everything?
Yeah, definitely. As a necessary, my view of God is a necessary reality that, he gives existence to everything else that exists. That he's the necessary reality, but everything else exists due to him. And
what is the origin of this God?
So so a necessary reality is something that has to be. It couldn't fail to exist. And for the sake of argument, you could argue that's the cosmos, right? You could say the cosmos has no origin. And at that second stage of the argument, I'm fine with that. So once you grant there's a necessary reality, that necessary reality can't have an origin. It just exists due to necessity. It's just that ground level, the most fundamental layer of existence.
Okay.
So I don't think God has an origin. So.
Okay. So are you thinking that the cosmos has an origin?
Right. Yes.
Okay. If and that origin being God, how can we know that the cosmos is not the actual thing this has been here all along, and is just as necessary as what you're thinking is the God?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. So I want to clarify 2 points on that. One.
Thank you.
Yeah. So one, I do think the cosmos had a beginning in time, but right. But even if that weren't the case, I'm going to leave that on the table for this argument, because the traditional contingency argument and the one I'm presenting actually is independent of that conclusion. Because even if the cosmos has always existed, if it's not the necessary reality, it exists due to a necessary reality. Okay.
So there's a dependency.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that's where I'm going to be. I'm just going to be agnostic for the sake of argument, whether the cosmos had a beginning or not, because I don't think it affects the argument.
Oh, okay. I'm curious, though, just as a little aside, do you believe that the cosmos is dependent on God?
Oh, right. Yeah. Everything other than God, I'm arguing, is dependent on God. So everything other than the necessary reality is dependent on the necessary reality. And since I'm arguing God's a necessary reality, therefore everything is dependent on God.
Well, I
Everything
think
else.
I think that this would actually be an important thing to explore, because there are a lot of people who I think would see the cosmos as an alternative to God, as a competitor to it, if you will. So I do think it's relevant, and I don't think I could really dismiss it so easily.
Oh, right. No, I agree. So going back to the argument, so the stage one, I find the terms for contingent and necessary, and that seems to be well enough.
Yeah.
Stage two, and then argue there has to be a necessary reality. And I know there are atheists who will agree there's a necessary reality, and then they'll say, well, that could be the cosmos, or it could be, but basically that's what they'd argue. And to me, at stage two, that's fine. I'm willing to grant that. A necessary reality, that could be God, it could be the universe. I guess somebody could argue something else, but I don't know what else they would argue. Maybe some Platonic something. But anyways, it's when we get to stage three that I say, well, what are the attributes that this necessary reality has to have? And I'm going to say its attributes have to be with unlimited. And that's where the cosmos theory, to me, falls off the table. At stage two, it's fine. God and the cosmos are competitors for the necessary reality in terms of what's going to conclude this argument. But it's when we get to that stage three is where the cosmos falls off the table for me.
So, and it falls off the table because it is dependent on God.
No, well, it falls off the table because it has limitations.
Oh, limitations. And God, in theory, does not have those limitations.
Right.
Okay. There is, I think, and we've not talked about the tooth fairy at all here. We probably do need to get into that. I do think that the bigger elephant in the room, though, is is God. And tooth fairy, I generally do think it is children's folklore. But the argument that I did kind of off the cuff make in the previous debate that I had with Zach, that nice gentleman from Pennsylvania, USA, he was asking me what my confidence level is in it. And I say, I can't say 100% that I can rule it out, for the same reason 100% I can't rule out a lot of other things. But I lean very strongly toward it being the 100% not real is as far as I can go with it. And I do that with the attitude of trying to be a proper skeptic and saying, if I make an absolute statement about something like this, then that could leave an opportunity for me to be proven wrong on it. And so what I'm trying to do is not be closed to that possibility. And I think that's why that came up in the last debate. He threw it out as an example, and it was great. It was great because it tested this whole attitude that I have on this. Would you say that your belief in God is at 100% or just extremely close to it?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I want to say 100, but I also want to say 99.9, I think is what Zach said. So, I mean, I guess I would say my own existence to me is the thing I'm most certain in. So then I would say anything else, I'm going to say, I guess by definition, I have to be slightly less anything, but it's right up there. So.
Okay. Now, I find it interesting that you consider belief in the tooth fairy to be irrational for adults, but belief in God to not be irrational for adults, when from an outsider perspective, outsider as in not being one who believes in deities, that there is a differentiation. There's like some kind of a preference there. Why is one less rational than the other, since both seem to have magical powers? To put it in very blunt and coarse terms, I don't mean to be trying to put things down here or anything. I'm just trying to be clear in what I mean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I understand. So
condescending. I don't mean to be condescending. That's what I mean.
Oh, that's fine.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure I understand. So it sounds like your question was the opening
I'm
question.
sorry, I went back
Is
to your
that
opening statement there, and where you had said that it's irrational for an adult to believe in the tooth fairy, and rational for an adult to believe in a deity or deities, I guess. One deity is what you favor. Yeah.
Mhm. Right. So I want to phrase it going forward that I'm going to say it's rational to believe in a necessary reality,
Okay.
and that necessary reality has attributes that are unlimited, and that's what I would then call God.
Okay.
And I think that helps cut through some of the discussion, because sometimes the word God has different meanings and such. But and the tooth fairy, to me, is a finite supernatural agent that we then argue, leaves money when you lose your teeth and so on. And to me, there's no good argument that I know of for that. And I think educated adults know that there's no good arguments for that.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, I would further argue that we would expect to find empirical evidence. I'm expecting if I lose a tooth, then I'm going to find money, or I'm expecting to have some trace of the tooth fairy. But God, well, we would expect there to be miracles, perhaps, but I don't know what under all the conditions God is going to work miracles under. So the lack of empirical evidence to me doesn't cut against God, but it does cut against the tooth fairy necessarily. But so it's the arguments and then that lack of evidence. And adults, educated adults, I think are aware of this. So, and I know we disagree on the arguments perhaps, but I'm just saying the rationale, we're aware that there is that distinction.
And so the anecdotes from millions or hundreds of millions of children throughout the ages it doesn't qualify as peer review, I suppose.
Right.
But you did say you don't want to get into people using personal experiences to justify that God exists. So, and that kind of would go down that direction. So we won't go there. I just thought I'd just kind of mention it because it does cross my mind. The concept of absolutely nothing that we touched on earlier, would you say it, would you agree with me that it has, from your definition, I think you do agree with me that it has no characteristics, no rules, it is absolutely nothing. There's no particles in it, there's no matter, there's no forces or anything at all.
I agree it has no characteristics in the sense that it has no tangible attributes.
Okay.
You couldn't bump into nothingness. I mean, it can't do anything to you, lacks all power. But I don't want to say that it follows no rules, because I'd say anything, any state of reality does follow the laws of logic, not because the laws of logic are some governing force, but because they're just, they're necessary. So I view the laws, and I know a lot of atheists will agree with me on this point too, the laws of logic are descriptive, but not prescriptive. So I don't think they exist out there in some Platonic realm and they make things fit, but I think that everything does have to obey the laws of logic, including the state of nothingness, if it were real.
Okay, so the absolute nothing as you see it, I think doesn't quite fit what the definition I'm thinking of it would be logically absolutely nothing, because you are imposing some constraints on it in your view.
Logical constraints, yeah, but not physical constraints.
If this absolute nothing would be outside of time, space, and the cosmos, like God is, why should it have those constraints?
Well, I would argue that God has logical constraints as well.
Okay, so God does not, so in your view, God does not have omnipotence?
Let me clarify on that. Yeah, I believe God has omnipotence. So, but I would say that that's still curtailed by logical limits. So like, I'm sure you're aware of like the stone paradox. Can God make a stone so heavy he can't lift it?
Yeah.
I would say no. I would say he is limited by logic. Again, not because logic is something outside of him that's holding him back, but because logic is the tool that we conceptualize to understand things, and God obeys or works within that parameter as well. So I would say,
because God didn't create that.
Right. I wouldn't say, it's not created. I don't think the laws of logic, again, they're descriptive, not prescriptive. So they're not something that's come about, and they're not something that has a causal powers. They're something that help us understand reality. because reality just has to obey the laws of, like, and it's hard to even make an analogy about this. I would say that the laws of logic are just conceptually necessary. So by omnipotence, so omnipotence is kind of a tricky word to define. The way that I define it is not that God can do anything, because then you can bring up the stone paradox. It's that God has no limitations on what he physically can bring about. So he can create any type of stone, but a stone that is so heavy that God can't lift it is a logically impossible stone, and God can't do logical impossible things. So anyways, so
it's an argument that I've heard that one before, and I generally don't like to bring it up because I think it's like it's cliched nowadays, and it's cliched in not the best way. Although
it's a good point, but
yeah, although it is an interesting paradox for a philosophy class, I suppose. So I wonder, how do you know that these limitations are imposed on your God? Is it defined in the Bible, or is it defined in some other reliable source? Has this thing been tested?
Okay, so to me, there are 2 points there. So one, while I do believe the Bible is God's vehicle for communicating revelation, as I said at the beginning, I don't think everything has to be found in the Bible to know about God. And there are several reasons for that. But so I want to make that point. And then the second point is that, sorry, you made a second point. So it was about the Bible and...
Or if there's other sources, what might they be?
Other sources. Right. Oh, the testable was the point.
Yes,
How do you test it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Empirical aspects.
Yeah. Yep. I don't think...
And I think you said he's outside of the empirical requirement.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't think everything has to have empirical evidence to be justified in believing in it. And I would want to know a reason why it would have to have it. Some things do need empirical evidence. Like I think the tooth fairy, to believe in it, I think it does need some empirical evidence, or at least a strong logical argument. I think it has neither, of course. Okay. But I think that if something has a strong logical argument, that's good enough. And I would say that I don't know why something would have to have empirical evidence.
So you don't think that, so if you think it's logical to require empirical evidence except for God?
I would say it's logical to require empirical evidence if there is no strong logical argument in favor of it, and if it's something that we would expect to find within the universe. Because only something within the universe could we expect to find empirical evidence for. At least I would say that fits what we mean by empirical. It's sensory. It's something that we can interact with. So like, to use a parallel example, I know of no logical argument in favor of the Grand Canyon's existence. And by definition, the Grand Canyon is the empirical type thing. So if there were no empirical evidence in favor of the Grand Canyon, then that would count against its existence. But if the Grand Canyon were supposed to be something outside the universe, if we didn't have empirical evidence for it, I wouldn't expect there to be.
Okay, so to say that there's that you're not aware of empirical evidence for the Grand Canyon doesn't mean that there isn't empirical evidence for it, though.
Right. No, right. There can be empirical evidence for God, and I think there is for some people, but I don't know that there is empirical evidence for everybody. So, to me, that's where I'm going more. We have the logical route. Okay. We have more the philosophical arguments.
So, do you think there's a logical argument for God?
Yeah, the argument from contingency.
Contingency. So the contingency is seems to be dependent on something being necessary. So what is the regulator that determines necessity for a deity?
Okay, right. So I agree. Yeah, it depends on something being necessary. So it's not so much that there's some regulator outside of all things that are like, well, here's what needs to be necessary, and we insert God here and so on. It's rather that I think there has to be a necessary reality. And then because that necessary reality, to me, logically has to be without limitations, therefore it leads to a being that has the attributes that we would then traditionally ascribe to God. Somebody doesn't have to use the word God. They could just say there's a necessary unlimited reality, and that's logically necessary, and we can call that God. And that's the word that we use. So that's where I more want to say the word necessary reality that's unlimited rather than using the name God, even though, of course, I use that, because I think that that word kind of slips in further complications.
Oh, okay. So why is God necessary?
Right. So
Yeah.
I would say that some state of reality is necessary,
Oh,
and then it's logically necessary for that state to lack limits. And then we call that state God. So you could, again, at stage 2, you could say, well, anything could be necessary. We haven't determined what it is. And I would agree. It's when we get to stage 3 that we say, well, this necessary reality lacks limits. And then we get to stage 4 and you say, well, that's what I would call God.
so are you thinking that natural processes are God?
No.
Okay, so that's not it. You think that it's not possible for natural processes to have resulted in the cosmos coming into being?
Well, can you define what you mean by natural processes?
Something that just, I guess, happens naturally without some kind of conscious deity is part of the mix, guiding it or something. It's just
Sure.
sort of like the scientific theory of evolution, which seems to be a natural process that just takes a very long time.
Sure. Okay. So I guess to put some paint to this or flesh on that structure, what that might be, I guess you could say, could there be some multiverse type thing outside of our cosmos altogether that's produced it, and you could call that a natural process? Is that what you have in mind?
It's the cosmos means everything, absolutely everything that we can perceive within reality. And the problem I have with the God claim is that it's outside of the cosmos. It is responsible for creating it, and there seems to be an exclusion of other possibilities, such as a natural phenomenon. And why it's narrowed down to just one, and just a single deity as well. This is the kind of things that I wonder about. I don't see how there could be a logical argument for one or multiple deities or some other natural process. That, like, I don't see logic as denying those other possibilities and favoring only one, because that seems arbitrary to me.
Okay, sure. So I guess where my hang up right now is with the natural process. I'm assuming the natural process would be a part of the cosmos, right? If it's, I don't know how it could be a natural process and stand outside the cosmos. So I don't know where that's a logically possible alternative.
Okay. So, like, assuming that the cosmos didn't exist at some point and started to exist, I guess is what I'm thinking. What would have triggered that to happen? Would that be a natural process, or would that be some deity? And people very often argue that that would be outside of time, and there was no time before then. And one of the logical problems I have with that is, in order to have change, you need to have time. It kind of change necessitates time. It depends on time. Otherwise, you don't have a change of things happening. So I don't know where you stand with where time fits into outside of the cosmos or not.
Sure. So
we're talking about hypothetically before the cosmos, right? So
sure. So whatever produced the cosmos would have to be something that's outside of time. And I'm going to argue that necessary reality has produced the cosmos. And again, since I'm going to be agnostic for the discussion whether it had a beginning in time, this necessary reality has to give existence to the cosmos, and that the necessary reality stands outside of time. I don't see a logical contradiction in something timelessly causing something, but let's just say that there is a logical problem with it. I'll grant, because I recognize there is a conceptual difficulty with it. I don't see the problem with the necessary reality interacting within time to produce that. So I do think the necessary reality stands outside of time in its prior state or prior condition. But let's just say, for the sake of discussion, that when it produces the cosmos, it has to interact within time. I don't see a problem there.
Yeah, I find that hard to accept. One of the alternatives I consider for a deity as a possibility that seems to be making more sense to me, because the question of where did this deity come from, of course, comes up. The point of absolute nothingness, as I was describing it, no rules or regulations at all. It's absolutely nothing. would also, as I explained to Zach in the previous conversation we had, there seems to me that it wouldn't be possible to predict what could erupt from it as well. And that could be, I suppose, an example of a natural process. Because as soon as you can predict how absolutely nothing will behave, you've now put something on it to say, okay, there's a behavior here, there's some set of rules or some logic that applies. It's now no longer absolutely nothing because it has these characteristics.
Okay.
Right?
So yeah, let me address.
And I see that as being a reasonable competitor to an all-powerful deity who puts everything into motion as a kind of a natural process alternative.
Okay, yeah. So I want to clarify two things. So one, you just used the word puts into process. So I want to make sure that for the listeners, they understand that I don't just view God as somebody that like kicked the ball, 6 billion years ago, but rather a necessary reality that's sustaining everything in each and every moment of their existence. But I just want to clarify that. But in regards to your point about something,
I don't mean, maybe I'm not remembering correctly, but I think you did. I asked you earlier if you think God is what created the cosmos and everything, and I believe you did affirm that.
Oh, absolutely. Right. Okay. But I want to affirm that I don't just affirm that. I don't think he just, because, like the deist type conception, like that God caused the Big Bang or got everything going and then stepped away and he's not doing anything now.
I'm not getting into that aspect of it.
Right. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
I want to make sure for the audience, they don't think that's what I'm arguing. Because sometimes people do think, oh, you must be arguing this. I want to make sure that's not what I'm arguing. Okay.
So when you could, because you've affirmed that that your God created the cosmos and everything. I guess when I said put things into motion, I was trying to put it in a gentle, as eloquent as I could way of saying God is the creator of all that. So God was before the cosmos is what that means.
Right.
Yeah. Side of it. Yeah. Yeah. So if you can clarify for me, then that'd be good. So, because you're saying you don't want it to look like you kicked the ball and made it happen, and that's definitely not what I mean to imply.
Oh, right. I just want to make sure. So, to use an analogy, and I do want to get to your point about things coming out of nothing and such, because that's a good point. So, to use an analogy, it's kind of like a computer. A program runs on the computer. Now, I think that program started at one point, okay, and we could say that's like the cosmos. But let's just say the computer program has always been running on the computer. The program is still dependent on that computer. So that's the way I view like the cosmos being dependent on God. Even if the program's always been running, or at least if the cosmos has always been here, it's always dependent on God, just like the program is always dependent on the computer. Okay, so I just want to make sure for the audience to understand that's what I'm arguing. Okay, that analogy. Okay, but I want to get to your point though about the nothingness. So
absolutely nothing. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost my earbud. Okay, so for the sake of discussion, I'm willing to grant that there's nothing logically incoherent about something popping into existence with no cause. Okay? Okay. So I'm fine if somebody wanted to argue that the universe just popped, or the cosmos just popped into existence without a cause. For the sake of discussion, I'm willing to grant that. Then my argument becomes what keeps it in existence. And to me, it has to have that necessary reality is the reality that keeps sustaining it in existence. And to me, that's logically required based on the relation between a contingent and necessary state of reality. So to me, this idea that there's some other process that, well, it could be the thing that is keeping the universe in existence, and maybe it's not the necessary reality. Or maybe there's some other necessary reality that's doing it. I don't see those as logically coherent. Okay.
So I was talking about how the cosmos came to be in this hypothetical conversation, not on what is sustaining it. So what I'm interested in is what started it off. For all we know, it could be that we're just in the very early stages of it continuing to grow and grow and grow. As some people believe is the case with our universe. As many people believe is the case with our universe due to red-shifted light and light waves and whatnot. And it's, with this whole idea of multiple Big Bangs, it's hard to say if that's actually what's going on or if there's more than meets the eye. And I suspect there's probably a lot more than meets the eye. But I'm just very interested in this. Seems to me would be, I guess, qualify as a natural process, something erupting out of absolutely nothing because it can't be predicted. And here's the result we have. We have life, the universe, and everything, and the cosmos, and all of this. And I'm not saying that this is actually what's happening. I'm just saying that this is perhaps another possible alternative to the idea that a God made it all happen. And in a sense, as I'd also mentioned to Zach, since we couldn't predict what could possibly erupt from absolutely nothing, logically. Perhaps it's possible that the deity erupted from absolutely nothing and then did make it happen. I know I'm kind of working against my own argument here, but I suppose I couldn't completely rule that out either, in the interest of being objective. This would bring an interesting revelation, for lack of a better term, to the idea that God was not indeed the very first cause, and God himself had a cause. So,
okay,
what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So, there's two distinct points there, just to me. So one, I look at the point of what if it wasn't God, but something else that gave the existence to the beginning of the universe, or got it started. To me, that's more of the Kalam cosmological argument, which I don't know if you're familiar with that, but that's...
I'm familiar with it. I didn't mean to make that argument because I think the Kalam cosmological argument is kind of dependent on a God being the creator of everything.
Well, I just meant in this terms of, if I were arguing that what's caused the beginning of the universe, and I would say, well, it has to be God. It could only be God. So for the sake of discussion, I'm willing to grant that it could have been a fluctuation out of nothingness that caused the beginning of the universe. It's not what I believe. Okay, I keep losing my earbud. Okay.
It's something I think shouldn't be overlooked and just summarily dismissed, though, because realistically, I do think we don't actually know what the real case is.
Sure. From a philosophical standpoint, I agree with you.
Okay.
Okay, so that's where, with this argument I'm presenting, I'm arguing what is the necessary reality, what are the attributes of the necessary reality that sustains the contingent things. I'm actually going to be agnostic for the discussion about what caused the beginning, if there was a beginning of the cosmos.
Mm-hmm.
Okay?
So, and as I stated earlier, I do think that dismissing that is problematic because necessary, we need to look back at the origins to be able to assess what is necessary and what is just contingent things.
Right. Well, okay, so I don't know that we're going to be able to empirically determine what's necessary or contingent. To me, this is a logical discussion when we get into does there need to be a necessary reality? So that's stage 2 of the discussion. And then stage 3, what are the attributes of this necessary reality? What do they have to be if there does have to be a necessary reality? So to me, the science of the matter, I'm fine with. Like, I don't know from a scientific standpoint if there was a beginning of the cosmos and what would have caused that. I'm fine to set that.
Yeah, I don't know either.
Right, I'm fine I do believe that God created the beginning, but I'm willing to grant for the discussion to be agnostic on that. So to me, it gets down to, does there have to be a necessary reality? And if so, what do its attributes have to be? To me, that's where the argument from contingency, that's the discussion. And that's why I mentioned earlier that it sounded like your discussion was going more the Kalam route. Because the Kalam route argues, there has to be a beginning, and what caused that beginning? It has to be the attributes of God. And I'm avoiding that whole discussion. That's a totally different.
To go there. Yeah.
Oh, it's fine. I just wanted to clarify for
the
audience and everybody that wasn't the argument. So yeah.
Okay. So for the second stage, you're saying it's questioning what actually is necessary, and the third stage being defining what those attributes are. So did you want to talk a little bit about the second stage or the third stage? Whichever order you want to do is fine with me.
Well, to me, it's the third stage is where things get is where the contention is probably going to lie. Because the second stage to me was just, does there have to be something necessary? And there are a lot of atheists, philosophers, and people that are willing to grant that there's something necessary. They just say that that could be the universe or the cosmos. And I think it is more plausible that there has to be something necessary for the mere fact that, as I said at the beginning, we can conceive of all the contingent things could have failed to exist. What would be left? By definition, it would have to be something necessary, whatever attributes that necessary reality has to have. So that's where, when we get into stage 3, is where it gets interesting. Yeah. And that's where I argue that, well, the necessary reality has to be unlimited in its attributes. And if that's the case, then God has to exist. That's where, to me, the debate lies.
Well, with the consequence being that what remains is necessary, kind of sounds like what Matt Dillahunty calls the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle fallacy. I'm going to have to put some thought into this before I can really give I think a proper intelligent response to it, because this is a new argument to me, and I'm not convinced that what's left behind is actually necessary. It could just be what's left behind, and it just hasn't shown the end of its existence yet, and it could actually just be a contingent thing that's deceiving us, and due to our short time of not able to see things as long term as what reality seems to have, maybe we're just jumping the gun and making jumping to a conclusion that it is necessary because it's still there, when that may or may not actually be the case. It could be contingent, it's just not fully through the process of disappearing.
Right. I agree with you in the sense that we shouldn't prematurely jump to the conclusion, oh, well, this is contingent because we haven't seen it go out of existence yet. But so keep in mind that I'm saying, if you take the things that are contingent, like, and say we don't know what those things are, but let's just say that there are contingent things. If they did fail to exist, by definition, because we're talking about all the contingent things, the totality of every contingent thing, by definition, whatever is left would be necessary. Now you could say, what if there is nothing contingent? Well, that's fine. Then there's necessary stuff, or a necessary reality. So to me, this is definitional. There has to be a necessary reality. And that's where I get to stay. And I understand, I'm curious what you mean by the Conan Doyle objection. I'm not familiar with that.
I'll just quickly look it up.
Sure.
I believe it's along the lines of here it is. It's basically saying that whatever is left behind, I think you eliminate all the possible options, and then whatever's left, no matter how complicated, must be true. I think that's what he's calling a fallacy, because it doesn't necessarily mean we've actually ruled everything out. Sure. I think is what Matt was getting at.
Sure. And I agree with that if we're talking about probabilistic options. But to me, when you get down to logically required options, so like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, I'm assuming you're referring to like Sherlock Holmes. Yeah, those are all going to be probabilistic conclusions. It's like, oh, well, we ruled out all these other people that did the crime, so they're the only one left. And I would say, well, there could be other possibilities. You can never inductively totally. So yeah, with this discussion, I think that's disanalogous in my view, because to me, if something's the logically required outcome, it's the only logically possible result left, it deductively would follow that it is the conclusion. But
not sure. Sounds like the audio problem's cleared up. There was a bit of static there.
Oh, okay.
That's why I muted myself in case to rule out me. So, is everything okay there, Jim?
I've got it good on my side.
Okay. Don't know if you heard the static. Okay. So yeah, the probabilistic aspect is definitely one that lends itself to that fallacy, I guess. And I'm glad that you agree with that, because I do think Matt Dillahunty made a lot of sense with that one. So that's kind of where I have some trouble with that second stage. Is I need some more time to think about it before I could come back with something I think more intelligent on this for you. So I'm at I don't know, can't accept it, can't agree with it, can't disagree with it. I have to put some thought into the argument from contingency. It's a very interesting one indeed. did you want to get into the attributes of?
Yeah. So. Right. I want to move on to stage 3, and this is where I seem to get the most pushback from skeptics. I think a lot of atheists or skeptics, agnostics, are willing to concede stage 2, and maybe that's not true for the people listening.
So I've encountered many atheists over the years who are not skeptics and actually don't have any justification for not believing in deities. So, but I have noticed that most skeptics I've encountered are atheists. And I think the reason is because they've applied skepticism and critical thinking to these different ideas, and they've come to the conclusion that they don't believe. They don't take a position against or for deities existing, or one or more of them. They just are kind of, they don't believe, they don't know, so they're atheist and agnostic, and so that's where they fit on those things. So I think it's a natural ultimate conclusion of being a proper skeptic to apply it to everything, to be as objective as possible. And then you end up with a lot of I don't know and I don't believe kind of outcomes from that. I think that's quite natural with skepticism. So, yeah.
Okay, yeah. So,
but there are many atheists who do use skepticism and rely on it. And that is common. That is a common theme.
Right. I was more just, throwing out just a general label of non-believers in God. So, or people who lack belief. So looking at stage 3, and this is where I think it gets more, or I think I'm going to receive more pushback, or at least need more clarification. So the necessary reality would lack limitations in its attributes. So I think that there are a couple of reasons for this, but the one I want to offer is that there's nothing outside of the necessary reality that would limit it, with it being that necessary ground level, most fundamental dimension or aspect of reality or existing thing. So to me, the simpler conclusion, and the one to me that logically follows, is that it's unlimited. There's nothing outside it to limit it. And somebody could say, well, maybe it just happens to have limitations. Well, if it just happens to have limitations, that's contingent, and now it's a contingent reality. Okay, so that's where I'm going with that. So.
Oh, okay, yeah. So anything that has any kind of limitation, and that would be any kind of rules of reality would be an example of a limitation.
Physical rules, but again, logical rules. The rules of logic, I'm saying, do apply to everything, not because they exist outside of the necessary reality. I don't think the laws of logic exist. I think that they're conceptual tools that have to apply
to help us understand reality.
Right. There's no possible reality that lacks the laws of logic, is what I'm going
that's kind of how I see time, is not as a traversable dimension, even though it's very conveniently expressed that way, which is very useful for scheduling and all sorts of other things, but and measuring the speed of change and speed something moves and changes and whatnot. I see it as more of just something we observe, kind of like logic. We observe it. It's phenomenal part of reality.
I'm not sure on my position on time. I think it's complicated, and I think that time does have a kind of reality, but I know there's a lot of debates about what it is. So certainly
I think science fiction has brought up a lot of paradoxes of time travel that make it quite an interesting thought experiment in many, many ways as well. Right. So the attributes, the main thing is you've mentioned the attribute is that physical limitations are contingent, are contingencies.
Mm-hmm.
And but you make an exception for God, saying that God is not limited physically, even though it sounds like God does have some limits when it comes to how he can operate logically. So he wouldn't be able to make certain things happen in a certain way because logic wouldn't allow it. So he does have these certain limitations on this.
Right. He wouldn't be able to do things that are logically impossible, not because logic wouldn't allow it in the sense that it stops him.
I used the wrong words. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I think we get it, or I think we're on the same page. But yeah, logical limitations would be the only limitations. And moral limitations, but I would say the moral limitations, so like God can't lie or God can't be unjust. But the moral limitations flow from the fact that he's a morally perfect being. Now, I said at the beginning, that's where it gets really complex, because that's to me, that takes some unpacking, but I would argue that as well.
So you're saying God can't lie is one of his limitations. Okay.
Right.
And if that's the case, that would mean that God is not a free thinker. God does not have free will.
That's interesting. So I don't think that being able to do evil, and let's just say that lying is evil for the sake of argument at least, I would say that doesn't negate free will. So free will, it doesn't require being able to do things that would be evil. Free will requires to be able to make a choice between two alternatives. And I would say that not all choices are moral choices. So like if God chose to create the universe or not, I would say that's not a moral choice. If I choose to eat ham or bologna sandwich, that's not a moral choice, and so on. So I don't think free will
some
is...
vegans might disagree, and
Sure. But we can think of free choices that are at least seem non-moral, and I would say that you could still have free will, and even though you can't will evil.
So this is the point that I disagree on, because if somebody has free will, then they can make those decisions on whether or not to do something good or bad. I'm walking down the street and I can choose whether or not to help somebody who's fallen down and gotten injured by accident. It sounds like you're saying God can't choose not to help them, basically.
Right. God would be morally obligated to do God would be morally confined, as it were, to always do the right thing.
Now, does God have omniscience? God knows everything.
Right.
Okay. So if that's the case, I think it would be fair to presume logically that if God is omniscient and knows everything, then God will know when somebody's getting injured in a precarious position here, and then would be morally obligated to help them, especially if somebody did some bad things and kicked a person down the stairs and they're down there bleeding to death, got hurt seriously, and then God should be morally, therefore, obligated to intervene and help them so that they don't die off, and help them at least be able to get up on their own will and start recovering. But as we see in reality, and there's many police cases where somebody's been left to die somewhere by their attacker, and they ended up dying because nobody was there to help them and no God intervened. So I find these moral limitations are either not being applied, or God really does have free will and is choosing to not fulfill those obligations.
Sure. So, yeah.
And so those would be part of my objections.
Right. So yeah, the problem of evil, and so this gets really complex, and I've done a couple of videos discussing the problem of evil, and I can go on a long time about it. So
forgive me,
I think
1 second. Just want to let everybody know we'll go to Q&A in probably maybe 5 minutes or so.
Okay.
And sorry to interrupt you guys.
This would be a good place to end in this particular part of our conversation, I think. Do you think so, Caleb?
Yeah, whatever. Yeah, that's fine.
Okay. I'm very curious to know about why you think that my objection is not consistent with logic, perhaps, or go ahead with what you're going to say.
No, your objection makes a lot of sense. So I just want to rehash where we're at with this. So God's all powerful, so he can stop somebody from getting injured and so on. He's all knowing, he knows about it.
Well, I wasn't saying he would stop them from getting injured, but
right.
But he should. But after the fact, somebody's been injured and left there for dead by their attackers, and they're in a serious condition. God would know that they're going to die. They're not going to survive. So therefore, God should intervene and make sure the coagulation is accelerated so they don't lose a lot of blood and they can get themselves to get some help. Right. And that's where I think that there's a problem if God can't lie, or God is obligated to be providing this assistance, and is not doing that, then God is choosing to allow somebody to suffer and die, which I think is abhorrent if they has the power to make these physical changes and help them.
Right.
It has the omniscience to know how to do it competently.
Right. And I agree, God knows about it. And I agree, we would have the moral obligation, if it's in our power, to help somebody in that way, to do it. Yeah. However, and I know this is going to get off, some of this is going to go beyond what we have time to discuss. I think God has other moral obligations that supersede those, and that's why he doesn't intervene in those situations.
Are you meaning like God is too busy, doesn't have enough time? Because I don't think that would be the case.
Right. No, not that he's too busy, not that he's busy doing other stuff, but that he has other moral obligations. And I know this, not going to have enough time to unpack all of this, but obligations to respect free will and so on. And that leads to a universe where God doesn't always intervene in all situations. And I have a couple of videos that somebody can watch.
Sure.
There's going to be more questions on it, but I did a debate last week with Skylar Fiction on this. I have a video on the problem of evil. I've left tons of comments on those videos. There's more that can be said, but I do have a response.
Maybe you can send links to those videos to Jim so he can include them in the YouTube video description here.
Sure.
So I'm thinking somebody who is a victim of a violent crime is tossed down the stairs and left to die. That sounds like a pretty major thing that God could easily intervene and deal with. It sounds to me like this is more of an excuse for God to ignore it, and kind of wishful thinking. And I think it would be, I think it's important for anybody who believes in this God to question it and to maybe even confront and say, you can do better than this. This is not good enough. This is a victim who they're exercising their free will. Their free will is not intending to get attacked and get left for dead. That's not what most people want. I think I would argue the overwhelming majority of people don't want that experience. They want to be able to continue to live their lives. And if somebody comes along and attacks them and puts them into that situation, then, of course, we're morally obligated to help. Why isn't God? God has more power, more knowledge. Why should God be held to a lesser standard? And then that bothers me. So that kind of thing, excuses are made for this. I'm not saying you're making excuses, but it bothers me that there's a mentality out there that there's an exception being made for this kind of thing, when really some being with these kinds of abilities should be held to account for it if they're not doing it,
Absolutely. I mean, the problem of evil, I agree. It's a very difficult problem. And I think it's the strongest argument against God's existence, which is where you could do a whole debate just on that topic. So I don't have enough time to go with my full response. Sure. But let me just throw out this, and this isn't a full response. We have a moral obligation to keep that person as alive as long as we can, but we're working within the universe. If somebody dies and God has the power to take them to a better reality, then it seems like God is fulfilling his obligation. Now, I don't think that explains everything about the problem of evil, but I think there is that component to consider.
And that component is making a presumption that there is some kind of, it sounds like that there's an afterlife that will be better somehow, but doesn't people want to continue to experience this before moving on? They've got more things they want to do here first. Like, shouldn't that be taken into consideration? A person has free will. Like, wouldn't a loving God want to support that and enable a person to have that second chance at life, to continue and get the maximum out of life that they possibly can, and continue to enrich the lives of their loved ones, and on and on?
Sure, but it does. But if heaven is real and there is a God who's created it, that logical possibility does seem to provide an undercutting defeater to the idea, like, well, what's God doing? And you're saying, well, there may not be a heaven, but we're working with the hypothesis that there is. And to me, that does provide at least an explanation there. But I definitely agree that the problem of evil is a difficult problem. There's a lot more that can be said about it, but in that scenario, I do see that as a rejoinder.
Maybe we should have a future conversation about that, and talk about the existence of heaven and hell. And I'll even bring a meme that I've shared around a few times that references the Bible and explains that heaven is hotter than hell, and see what you think. I'll send you a link to it later, and we can have some fun with that. But we can get serious about the ethical and moral sides of it if you like. I'm game.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely.
Hey, Jim.
Thank you.
If you're okay with questions, I'm okay with it. Or did you have any questions for me, Caleb, before we go on? No.
I don't. And there, again, these discussions could go on for centuries, which they have. But yeah, I'm good. We can keep talking at a later point.
All right.
You bet. Well, thank you guys.
Questions first?
It's been enjoyable, and I think it's been enjoyable also, not just in addition to the content, but that you guys are so respectful of each other. I can tell you guys are both seasoned debaters. You don't get all riled up and disturbed by the debate intensity. So with that, excited to go to the Q&A. So this is going to be a good one. I got a lot of quick ones that I want to go through, and then if anybody has any other questions that they have and want to have added, you can just put an @ModernDayDebate in the live chat, and then we will add it to the list. So, Super Chats, by the way, I forgot to mention, Super Chats go to the top of the list, and also Super Chats, you can make a comment toward one of the speakers rather than just a question. And so we'll start with Super Chats. Steven Steen, oh gosh. He says, he's a local troll. He just
Fantastic.
Sexually
Thank you for being here.
Sexually harasses me all the time. He says, James and I once touched bellies. No fairy tale. I can assure you that is a fairy tale. We have never touched bellies, but I appreciate your super chat, Steven Steen, you sicko. So, next up, fully automated luxury LGBT plus transhumanist space and com. Thank you for being here, and thanks for your super chat. They said, this is back when, by the way, I did want to mention, I'm so sorry. The title was wrong. I forgot to change the title because last second I had to switch things, and they had said the title is wrong and says Hovind is debating evolution. Sorry, but that did not mean to do any sort of bait and switch or anything like that. It's basically Hovind will be on tomorrow for the controversial evolution as a dangerous theory idea debate. Yes, Randolph.
And I can confirm we've been talking about this for quite a few days of having this specific topic that we have today, and so I support Jim on what he's saying there, and I'm sure Caleb will too.
Thank you. Yeah. I appreciate that. My bad. It's just a long day, but Think Club, thanks for your super chat. Glad to see you. By the way, Think Club is down in our description. It's another debate channel you can check out. Highly encourage it. He says, if a man is in prison and the other inmates will kill him if he doesn't believe in God, is it justified or unjustified for him to believe in God? I think that's for Randolph, if I had to guess.
Oh, I suspect it's probably for both of us. I think that the problem in prison or any dangerous living arrangement, and you got to remember, prison is the home for those people who are there. It is their home. Using justifications for killing, I think, is wrong. But what I'm more interested in is just the committing murder itself. I have objections to it. So I think whether or not they justified it, they're not. It doesn't justify it. But the example given is a very, very lousy justification. And it is an example of the kind of violence that goes beyond vilification that I am very staunchly against, because I do think everybody should be equal under the law and have equal opportunities for things. And I think it's unfortunate. It's a very oppressive attitude, and to me, it's an unethical one. Caleb, what is your perspective on that?
Okay, I want to make sure I understand the question. Is it the statement sounds like it's saying, is somebody morally justified in not believing if they were going to be killed if they didn't believe? Or
my understanding of the question is that there's a number of people in prison who believe in God, and they're going to kill the one inmate because that one inmate does not believe in God, and wondering if that's morally justified.
Well, no. Murdering somebody is morally unjustified, but I want Jim to clarify.
I think that that one's a tricky one. I think they were saying, if, let's say, I think he's trying to get at the potential utility in some cases of religious belief. In this case, he's saying, if they tell you you're going to get murdered tomorrow if you don't start believing in God, and is it justified, reasonable, rationally justified to try to bring yourself to believe and to actually bring yourself to believe in a God because you're thinking, I don't want to get murdered?
Self-defense is always rationally justified. And when somebody is coerced into believing or taking a certain position, the question becomes, is it actually genuine, or are they just doing it for self-defense reasons? And I think most of the time people are scared into it and they do it for self-defensive reasons. Caleb?
Yeah, I mean, if they're talking about, is it morally justified for somebody to believe simply because they have the threat of death? I mean, I don't really know how to comment on the question. I mean, I would say that obviously the scenario, if somebody's going to kill somebody, that's wrong. Is that other person morally justified to then start believing in God? I don't know why that would be wrong for that person, but
I think they mean like rationally. So like
yeah.
justified in the way like rationally speaking of like, am I justified in believing like the lights are on in this room? And I'd be like, yeah, like my empirical sense tells me so. So that, like I have a good
I see.
reason. I think
I
he's
don't know. I don't know on the answer to that question whether if something's rationally justified simply because there's a threat. I mean, it does make sense to self-preserve. From my perspective, if you flip it around, is a Christian morally or rationally justified to stop believing because somebody threatens them? I would say no. They should maintain their belief. But I can't comment on that for a non-believer because they're working with a different set of beliefs in that regard. So.
Gotcha. Thank you very much. And with that, sorry about that, got thrown off. New subscribers, wanted to say Thomas Milam, thanks for subscribing. Saw that earlier in the stream. Glad to have you here. And also, we have other questions. Mind Onion, thanks for your question. They asked for dry apologist. If God has constraints, doesn't he have limits? If the necessary thing has to be unlimited, that isn't. If the necessary thing has to be unlimited, isn't God ruled out? So I think
I understand the question. So that I'm saying that God has logical and moral limits, and then doesn't that seem to contradict the third stage of the argument where I say the necessary reality lacks limits? So I want to clarify because this is the most common objection that I get to this argument. When I say that the necessary reality has to lack limits, I'm talking about metaphysical and metaphysical and physical limits. I'm not talking about logical or moral limits. And as I said earlier, that the moral one is difficult because I think it's derived from the fact that it is an unlimited reality. So it's more of a second stage limitation, but that's going to require a whole nother debate to justify why that would be the case. But to make things simple, I think that God is without limits except for those derivative limitations that logically follow from the fact that he's an unlimited reality. So again, there's going to be more on that. But.
Gotcha. Anything, Randolph?
I have nothing for that. That's it sounded like a question directly for Caleb.
You bet. Next up, Midwave Productions. Thanks for your question. Glad you're here. They said, Randolph, how can we know anything on your worldview since according to science, empirical studies are not the observation of a public world, but of brain states, or in parentheses, indirect realism?
Wow. First of all, I'll clarify that atheism is not a worldview. It's just an absence of belief in deities. But I suspect the worldview comment is just alluding to the idea that there's a scientific way of looking at reality. And from what I know throughout my life is that science is what we rely on to see the world and understand our surroundings and comprehend reality. Of course, I can't rule out the possibility that we're just part of an incredibly complex simulation. And if we are, then in my opinion, it's an incredibly good one. But that's just my limited perspective. I don't know for certain. I can't rule that out. But from what I've seen, I believe that I'm living in reality and interacting with it, and that things are very consistent. So I am making an assumption, yes, that that reality is what it is. That it is.
Gotcha.
I hope that answers the question. I'm not quite sure how better I could answer that.
You got it. Thank you very much, Randolph. And Utopia Blaster, thanks for your question. He said, for Randolph, what naturalistic mechanism or process explains why there is something rather than nothing?
Okay, so there is a presumption there that there must be something rather than nothing. And I'm not convinced that that's actually necessary. I am going to be looking into the argument on contingency that Caleb has introduced me to, because that'll give me some further things to think about. But I don't actually have an answer. I don't have some kind of explanation for that, because I'm not convinced that it's necessary for there to be something rather than nothing. Maybe if they want to clarify the question, I can go over it again a little later. Maybe I'm not quite understanding them right.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, Brenda let me make sure. Von Assen. Brenda's been here before. Good to see you, Brenda, and thanks for your question. It was for Dry Apologist, and it is, if God exists outside of time and space, is it not accurate to say that he exists nowhere at no time?
Yeah, I mean, I agree that he doesn't exist within a given location or a given point in time, because he is outside of space and time. But if by that they mean that he doesn't exist, I wouldn't agree with that terminology, because if you're spaceless and timeless, then yeah, you don't exist at a specific point in time. Rather, he's omnipresent. He's causally present at all points in time, but not dependent upon those points in time. So I agree essentially with what they said, but I'm wondering if they mean something else by it too. So
I just have one quick question for you. Is God powerful enough to not be omnipresent if he wants to, or does he not have a choice in that?
So since I'm arguing that he has to be an unlimited being, it would be logically necessary that he would have to be all powerful. So he couldn't fail to be all powerful. However,
omnipresent.
Omnipresent, that too. So he couldn't fail to be omnipresent. However, I also believe that he did unite himself to within the world as a human being, as Jesus. So in that sense, Jesus in his humanity is limited to a specific space and time, but the divine nature is not, and that would be logically necessary, is my position.
Thank you very much. Next,
Thank you.
JMD Apologetics 101, glad to see you. They asked, this is the first time I think we have more questions for an atheist guest. This is,
wow.
They're coming after Randolph.
I hope I can answer them.
It's John asked, what would Randolph consider as evidence for a proposition as true, and what would that consist of for God? And he's got a two-parter, so I'm going to just let you answer that first one, and then I'll jump to part B.
Okay, so what would it take? I guess, would it be fair? I think they're asking, what would it take for convincing me that a deity actually exists?
I think
I think that's how I understand it. Does that make sense to you, Jim?
I think to be, let's see. Yeah, well, so it's kind of a...
I think they're asking, like, with the proposition, it kind of throws a bit of a curveball on it. It seems to me they're asking, what would it take to prove to me that a deity exists?
Yeah, I think that's basically it.
So I did actually post about this on Twitter quite a while ago. And so the question was, what would it take to prove to me, an atheist, that an all-knowing and all-powerful deity is real? And then I said, basically, what it would require is to grant to me omniscience and omnipotence for about a week, so that I can verify this for myself and explore the universe and all that. The only revision I would make to that would probably be to ask for a fortnight rather than a week. Just because I think 2 weeks would be just more fun than 1 week.
You got it. Thank you.
What was the part two?
Part two is, what should we expect on the God hypothesis from this perspective of, I think this is kind of what you've already answered, from your perspective on like what it takes to believe something is true. So if you feel like you've got that, we can move. But
yeah, I think one of the problems is that I've encountered is there's an awful lot of people who will believe things because it fits with their own perspectives and their own opinions about how things should be, or they believe it because it appeals to them somehow and they just want to believe it. They like the idea of it. They fall in love with it, or somebody has sold the idea to them and it sounded very convincing because the person was confident, charismatic, or whatnot. The problem is that there are people who will jump to conclusions that, oh, okay, so this must be it because nothing else was. Oh, science doesn't have an explanation for how the universe actually began before the Big Bang, so therefore it must be God, or whatever it is they've been convinced it is. They're limiting to just one possibility rather than remaining open to different possibilities. So I think embracing doubt is a very important thing to do, and I've noticed that many religious organizations will promote the idea that doubt is problematic, and doubt is something that should be rejected and discouraged. But I think doubt is actually a very healthy intellectual tool for us, and we should do that. And I think if you really honestly, genuinely want to know that your belief is correct, then doubt and critical thinking are probably your greatest allies in being true to yourself in that.
Gotcha. Thanks so much. Next up, where did my note go here? There it is. Okay. S.J. Thomason, thanks for your question. Glad to have you here. S.J. asked, does he also have objections? And I think, so this is back to the question of when Think Club asked if it was, at one point the interpretation is whether or not he was asking if murder is wrong. S.J. asks, she says, does he also have objections to the murder, in capital letters, of the unborn? I think, I suppose it could be for either of you, so I'll let you both answer if you'd like.
Did you want to answer first, Caleb? I do have an answer for this.
Sure. I'll go first. I mean, the unborn, I believe they're human persons, and yeah, I mean, killing them is murder.
Gotcha. And Randolph, if you want to answer as well.
So, I am an advocate for freedom of bodily autonomy, which means that I am in favor of terminating a pregnancy at any stage. And I know there are even atheists who disagree with me on this and have various cutoff points in mind. I don't, because I think the sovereignty of the pregnant person is just as important as the sovereignty of the person who's not pregnant. And so the decision should be theirs, and it should be one that can be made freely, without interference, without coercion, and without pressure. They should have the right to do this, because when we start taking away a person's rights to bodily autonomy, we are, as a society, as Alabama's doing right now in the USA, is basically relegating to a slave class through forced birthing, and making them a person with lesser rights, so therefore a lesser citizen. And that's not equal justice. That's unfair. It's whatever the reason, or no reason at all. I think that bodily autonomy needs to be respected, and that's the higher standard. And calling it an unborn child is a term I object to, because it's misleading. It is a fetus, or it's a zygote, or depending whatever stage it's at, it's not born yet. So that's my view on it. And as I know, a lot of people disagree with it. There are many people who also agree with me on it, and this is one of the problems with ethics and whatnot. With regard to murder, I'll just elaborate a little bit. I do think that capital punishment is unethical and immoral. And so places like Texas, USA, that have capital punishment, as far as I know, I disagree with them. And I think the state is systematically murdering people. And so I object to that. I hope that's an answer that answers SJ's question appropriately.
You
and
got
fully.
it. Thank you very much, Randolph. And next up, our last question. Kilodoggy1, thanks for your question. Yes, it is. Didn't realize it until I read it. So for Dry Apologist, if you were God, would you create beings capable of torturing each other, or would you not allow them to have that freedom?
I mean, the question would be if I were God. I mean, if I were calling the shots, I would not, but I don't have the knowledge or the attributes that God has. So my position, like on the problem of evil, which I recognize is a really complicated issue, is that if I really were in the position of God, I would do exactly what God does, because that is the most moral thing to do. Not in terms of directly, like as if God is in favor of evil and suffering, he's not, but in terms of how he has created the universe, that is what's morally required of God, and we're just not in the state to fully appreciate that. We can argue for why it would be the case, but it really doesn't matter whether or not I would do it or not. So emotionally, yeah, I'm like, no, I wouldn't want that, but at the same time, that doesn't mean that God isn't morally justified.
You got it. Thanks so much from both of our speakers. We really appreciate you being here. It's been a blast. And before giving our final goodbyes, I want to mention we are thrilled. I just loaded this in. The debate tomorrow between Kent Hovind and Mr. Archaeopteryx. So this is the one that we had loaded earlier today. And that's going to be a blast. It's going to be tomorrow. It's going to be epic. And we are excited for it. So thanks for your patience again with my clumsiness getting the name of today's debate set. And again, just can't say thanks enough to our speakers for being here. Thanks for hanging out with us, you guys. It's been a pleasure. And I want to mention one last thing. Their links, of course, are down in the description. So if you enjoyed their stuff, totally encourage you to check out their links below. And gentlemen, any last goodbyes? Thanks for being here.
Okay. Thank you very, very much for having us on this and on this program. It's always a delight to be here. You're an excellent host, and it was wonderful to converse with you, Caleb. And I know we don't agree on everything, but I think overall we had what I consider to be a very constructive conversation, and I found it quite interesting, especially a lot of the perspectives you shared were fascinating.
Yeah, likewise. Thanks so much, Randolph and Jim. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot. And yeah, it was a great conversation. If there are any other people out there who want to debate me on a topic, message me in the comments and I'll debate anybody on these things. So.
Rad.
It's a pleasure to meet you, Caleb.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
It's been a pleasure. For those of you out there, keep sifting through the reasonable from the unreasonable. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks.